The HOA president stood on my dock, clutching a clipboard like it was a holy relic, demanding I tear down the structure within 48 hours, completely unaware that I legally owned every single drop of water she was staring at. It was barely 7 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of morning where the mist rises off Silver Creek Lake like wood smoke, and the only sound is the water lapping against the cedar planks. But then I heard it, the sharp, unmistakable clack of designer heels on my dock. Brenda Vance was marching toward me, her face pinched in that specific brand of suburban fury that usually precedes a lecture on lawn height or trash placement. "This industrial eyesore is tanking our property values," she snapped, waving a violation notice in my face while I just sat there, sipping my coffee and feeling the wood grain beneath my feet, thinking about how this dock was the very last thing my wife, Sarah, and I had sketched out together on a hospital napkin before the cancer took her. "Mon Oppos, I said quietly, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "You might want to double-check those property lines before you start making threats you can Oppos." T back up, but she didn't Oppos. T listened, because people like Brendan never do. They just see a grieving widower in a faded flannel shirt and assume he's an easy target. Little did she know I was an Oppos. T, just a retired old man with a hobby. I was a civil engineer with 30 years of experience designing the very infrastructure that kept this county from washing away, and I was about to prove that I didn't end Oppos. T just owned the dock. I own the entire lake system. What would you do if some neighborhood tyrant tried to bulldoze the last memory you had of the person you loved most? Drop your wildest HOA nightmare in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from, because what I'm about to tell you is a masterclass in why you should never, ever pick a fight with a man who knows where the blueprints are buried. My name's Elias Thorne, and 3 years ago, I thought I was buying a quiet retirement spot in Blackwood Estates to heal my broken heart. But instead, I bought a front row seat to a war with a woman who thought a suburban zip code gave her the power of a Roman emperor. Sarah and I have been married for 32 years, the kind of marriage where you finish each other in Oppos, as sentences and plan out decades that you assume you and Oppos. LL actually get to live, and our dream was this lakefront house. We'd spend our final months talking about the view, sketching a dock that followed the natural curve of the shoreline, something organic and beautiful, not those plastic, floating platforms the HOA seemed to love so much. She made me promise I'd build it exactly how we planned, even if she wasn't in Oppos, T there to see the sunrise from it. And I'm a man who keeps his promises. Blackwood Estates was supposed to be a dream. 45 high-end homes circling a pristine 200-acre lake, the kind of place where doctors and retired pilots wave to each other over manicured hedges. The dock project was my therapy, 6 months of precise engineering, every bolt torqued to spec, every piece of hand-shaped cedar smooth as silk under bare feet, and I had the permits to prove it. The county inspector even called it a piece of art disguised as infrastructure, saying he wished every homeowner had half my attention to detail. But then came Brenda Vance, a woman who looked like a real estate headshot come to life, with blonde highlights that cost more than my monthly mortgage and a smile that felt about as warm as a stainless steel fridge. She'd moved in 3 years ago, a massive colonial mansion that loomed over the lake like a sentinel, and within 8 months, she'd sweet-talk her way into the HOA presidency after the previous board. Mostly old-timers who believed adults could manage their own lawns. Resigned because they couldn't and Oppos. T stand her and Oppos, vision and Oppos, for community excellence. Brenda's first order of business was and Oppos, waterfront standardization, and Oppos, which was just a fancy way of saying that every dock had to look identical and, coincidentally, be built by Vance Construction, a company owned by her husband, Marcus. When I showed her my county-approved permits, she looked at them like they were written in crayon and told me that community standards supersede municipal approvals. Her oversized diamond ring catching the light as she gestured dismissively at my life and Oppos' work. It was an industrial eyesore, she claimed, though in reality, it was a handcrafted masterpiece that put her husband's flimsy plastic docks to shame. The violation notice she handed me threatened a $500 daily fine and a lien against my house if the structure was in Oppos. T demolished in 72 hours, citing in Oppos. Emergency community protection powers in Oppos, that she'd likely invented over a glass of Chardonnay the night before. I stood there, feeling the gravel of my driveway under my boots, watching her walk away with the confidence of someone who'd never been told Indapos, no Indapos, in her entire life. That evening, I sat on the dock, watching the sky turn a deep, bruised purple, listening to a loon call across the water, and I remembered something Sarah used to say. Indapos, Elias, when bullies pick on engineers, they usually end up regretting it because they don Indapos. To realize we Indapos, we're the ones who know how the world is actually held together. Indapos. The next morning, I was at the county records office before the doors even opened, my engineer's brain in full detective mode because you don and Apos. T spend 30 years building bridges without learning that the most important part of any structure is the foundation you can Indapos. TC. Mrs. Gable has worked the records desk since the mid-'80s, a woman with a memory like a steel trap and a deep-seated love for property drama. And when I explained Brenda's ultimatum, her eyes lit up like a kid on Christmas. Riparian rights, she whispered, pulling out a magnifying glass that looked older than the building itself. I haven Indapos. T seen an original deed with those magic words in a long, long time. Back in school, we had a professor who drilled into us that water rights are the Wild West of American law, and most people assume that if you buy lakefront property, you own up to the water's edge, and that's the end of it. But some ancient deeds include language that dates back to the original formation of the county. As it turned out, my property was Indapos. T just a lot in a subdivision. It was part of the original Thorne family homestead from 1912. No relation to me, just a lucky coincidence in the name, and the deed included perpetual water management authority for the entire Silver Creek watershed. My great-uncle had Indapos. T been the owner, but the man I'd bought the house from had inherited a legal anomaly that most lawyers wooed in Indapos to even know to look for. Mrs. Gable emerged from the back room 20 minutes later, smelling of dust and old ink, clutching a manila folder that looked like it held the secrets to the universe. Mr. Thorne, she said, spreading a map from 1924 across the counter, your property holds the original charter for the Silver Creek Dam, and according to this, the owner of Lot 12, which is you, has final approval over any and all modifications to the lake bed and the surrounding tributaries. I drove home in a daze, the irony of the situation settling in my chest like a heavy weight, realized that Brenda was Indapos. T just wrong about my dock. She was living in a house that sat on land I technically controlled the drainage for. That evening, I walked into the HOA's emergency board meeting at the community center, a room that smelled like stale coffee and floor wax, where 15 or so neighbors sat looking like they were waiting for a root canal. Brenda had a full PowerPoint ready, and Indapos, protecting our investment, and Indapos, featuring photos of my dock cropped to look as menacing as possible, while her husband Marcus sat in the front row, looking like a man who'd already spent the commission on the 10 new dock contracts he expected to sign once mine was torn down. When Brenda finished her speech about Indapos, aesthetic harmony Indapos, and Indapos, legal mandates Indapos, I stood up, cleared my throat, and calmly dropped the manila folder on the table. According to these county records, I said, my voice echoing in the sudden silence, the HOA has zero jurisdiction over the water because I hold the original management charter for the Silver Creek watershed, and if anything, I'm the one who should be issuing permits to you. The room went so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights, and Brenda's face went from a smug tan to a pale, sickly green in about 3 seconds. Her husband Marcus started blustering about Indapos, fabricated documents Indapos, and Indapos, outdated laws Indapos, but I just pointed to the county seal and the signature of the state surveyor. Margaret Vance, a retired attorney who lived 3 houses down, leaned over to look at the papers and let out a low whistle, telling the board that if these were valid, the HOA had been operating outside to their legal boundaries for over a decade. The meeting devolved into a series of panicked whispers and nervous glances, and as I walked out, I felt the first real sense of peace I'd had since Sarah passed away, knowing that the Indapos, engineer's brain Indapos, had an Indapos. T failed me, but the war was far from over. 3 days later, I was woken up at 6 in the morning by a sound like a gunshot, the splintering of wood. I ran to my kitchen window, just in time to see Marcus Vance's oversized wakeboarding boat idling 50 yards off my dock, with a massive tow line attached to the very corner where I'd planned to put Sarah's memorial bench. Marcus was at the helm, looking back with a grin that said he thought he was being clever, while the corner of my dock hung in the water like a broken limb. "Mechanical failure," he shouted over the roar of the engine. Throwing his hands up in a mock gesture of apology, throttle got stuck in forward. "Real sorry about the mess, Elias." I stood there, bare feet on the cold kitchen tile, watching the diesel exhaust drift over the water, and I didn't oppose. I didn't oppose. Scream. I just reached for my phone and hit an oppose. Save an oppose. On the high-definition security footage I'd installed the day after the board meeting. In engineering, we call this A and oppose. Point of failure and oppose. And Marcus had just provided me with exactly what I needed to move from defense to offense. By noon, I had my own team of and oppos, Avengers and oppos, assembled at my kitchen table, starting with Patricia Mendez, a water rights attorney who looked like she could negotiate a peace treaty between two warring nations before breakfast and still have time to crush a corrupt city council. She was followed by an environmental consultant and a detective from the County Water Patrol who I'd worked with years ago on a bridge inspection project. We sat there, surrounded by blueprints and legal pads, while I played the footage of Marcus deliberately backing his boat into my dock and then gunning the engine to tear the wood away. "That's not a mechanical failure," the detective said, making notes in his ledger. "That's criminal mischief and destruction of historically protected infrastructure. And since that dock is tied to a federally recognized watershed management point, he's in a world of trouble he can oppose to even imagine." But the real bomb dropped when Patricia finished her review of the HOA's incorporation papers from 15 years ago, her face twisting into a predatory smile that made me glad I was on her good side. "Elias," she said, leaning back in her chair, "they never actually secured the rights to the lakefront when they built this subdivision. They just assumed it was public land and started charging homeowners an oppos, water access fees and oppos, that have gone straight into the HOA's general fund. For 15 years, Brenda and her predecessors have been collecting money for something they don and oppos. Own. And according to your deed, that money actually belongs to a trust meant for the maintenance of the dam. A trust you are now the sole trustee of. We did the math, and with 70 years of compound interest and a decade of illegal fees, the trust was sitting on nearly $900,000 that the HOA had been essentially skimming from. The next week was a blur of legal filings and surprise inspections, and while Brenda was busy posting on the neighborhood app about how I was in oppos, exploiting my grief in oppos, to bully the community, the FBI's Infrastructure Task Force was quietly reviewing the security footage of Marcus's and oppos boating accident. An oppos, you see, when you sabotage a structure that is part of a federally regulated flood control system, it stops being a neighborhood dispute and starts being a federal crime. On Thursday morning, while Brenda was having her hair done for her upcoming and oppos, Victory and oppos party, 3 black SUVs pulled into Marcus's driveway, and the entire neighborhood watched as he was led away in handcuffs, charged with felony destruction of critical infrastructure and insurance fraud. Brenda tried to scream about a conspiracy, but when the EPA inspector arrived 30 minutes later to inform her that her Colonial Mansion's drainage system was illegally discharging into a protected watershed, my watershed, she finally realized at the end oppos, easy target and oppos, had teeth. The final showdown happened at the town council meeting a month later, a standing room only event where the air was thick with the scent of cheap coffee and the nervous energy of 45 homeowners who just realized their property values were tied to a fraudulent HOA. Brenda showed up in a black power suit, flanked by a lawyer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth, but she didn't and oppos to get to speak first. Instead, the county attorney took the podium and laid out the facts. The HOA was legally void, the fees they'd collected were fraudulent, and the oppos, eyesore and oppos, dock she tried to destroy was actually a registered monitoring station for the county's water supply. I stood up last, carrying a single photo of Sarah sitting on the very first dock we'd ever visited, and I looked Brenda right in the eye. "This was never about the wood or the permits," I said, my voice steady for the first time in years. This was about the fact that you thought you could erase a man's history because it didn't in Oppos. T-fit you're in Oppos, aesthetic, and Oppos. But an engineer knows that if you ignore the history of the land will eventually take back what's hers. The aftermath was a landslide of justice that felt better than any revenge story I'd ever read. Marcus took a plea deal that included 18 months in federal prison and a massive fine that wiped out Vance Construction, while Brenda was forced to sell the colonial mansion at a fire sale price to cover the restitution for 15 years of illegal HOA fees. The HOA itself was dissolved and replaced by a conservation trust with Margaret Vance, the honest lawyer, as the head, and my dock. My dock was rebuilt using the trust funds, this time with a plaque at the end that reads into Oppos, Sarah's View, and Oppos. Now, every morning, I sit there with my coffee, watching the mist rise off the water I legally protect, knowing that the last promise I made to my wife has been kept in a way that would have made her laugh until she cried. But here's the thing that still has the neighborhood talking and the comment sections on the local news sites on fire. When the HOA was dissolved, it was discovered that the land the community center sits on was also part of that 1912 homestead, which means I technically own the building where Brenda used to hold her in Oppos, trials, and Oppos. I've decided to turn it into a community environmental center. But some of the neighbors think I should have just sold it and pocketed the cash, while others say the HOA was actually right about into Oppos, standardization into Oppos, and that the lake looks in Oppos, messy in Oppos, now that everyone is building their own style of docks. So what do you think? Was I right to tear down the entire system to save my dock? Or did I go too far in seeking justice for a memory? Is an HOA a necessary evil for property values? Or is it just a playground for petty tyrants with too much time on their hands? Drop your thoughts below. Let's get a debate going because I'm sitting on my dock right now, and I've got all the time in the world to read them. Don't forget to subscribe for next week's story about the neighbor who tried to build a fence on my property and ended up losing his entire driveway. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that people never stop trying to move the lines. They just forget that some of us have the maps. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you at the next property line.